Stoffel Vandoorne will test an IndyCar. It's all part of a busy week of IndyCar news. Testing was yesterday at Barber Motorsports Park. We've got the results from that. And the new NASCAR game came out to the public today, and opinions are mixed to say the least. In this video, I will explain why new games, especially new franchises, are usually not worth picking up on the first year of release. And I know, half of my face is missing. I figured now was a good time to shave, otherwise people are going to start thinking I'm Santa Claus. The good news, if you like the beard about facial hair, is it always grows back. Okay, so lots of news today. So what we're going to do is launch some music and start talking about IndyCar, because there's a bunch of stuff happening all at once, and then I'll kind of wrap it up and then we'll talk about the NASCAR video game. So it was revealed today that Stoffel Vandoorne will test for Arrow McLaren SP in IndyCar, though the track that they will test has not yet been finalized. It's actually apparently tough for the team to find a track to rent to perform this test. Of course, all of the buzz yesterday, we'll talk about it in just a second, was about Nico Hülkenberg in his first IndyCar test. So it seems like Arrow McLaren SP is very serious about a third car, whether it comes in 2022 or 2023 as they plan. That remains to be seen. Speaking of testing at Barber Motorsports Park, these are the results that we had yesterday. 5 drivers, 5 teams. Dave Malukas leading the way. He was second in the Indy Lights Championship last year. He's a driver from Ohio, and he drives for Dale Coyne Racing, and I think a lot of folks are expecting him to have that seat next year. Ryan Hunter-Reay in the 20 car for Ed Carpenter Racing was second. Devlin DeFrancesco for Andretti Autosport was third. Kyle Kirkwood, Indy Lights champion, was fourth. And Nico Hülkenberg fifth, though I would say, Nico Hülkenberg fans, don't be too worried about that result. Romain Grosjean was about that far off after his first IndyCar test, and we now know exactly how that ended up turning out. Now, testing will resume on Friday at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and as I understand it, it will be open to the public. If you go out to the Turn 2 Mountains, you can watch this. The 26 Andretti Autosport car will be shared by Linus Lundqvist, the third place finisher in the Indy Lights Championship, and Kyle Kirkwood, of course, the champion. And the number 3 Penske car will be driven by Dave Malukas, the second place in the Indy Lights Championship. So Dave Malukas has been all over the place testing, though, again, this is really just an Indy Lights thing. Don't read too much into Malukas testing for Penske. So this gives me an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about IndyCar silly season, because a bunch of things have been coming out recently. As I've said in previous videos, the grid's going to be expanded next year. You're going to see probably at a minimum 27 full-time cars. Honda, the Honda side of things is completely booked, essentially. I still kind of feel like, I've been told by folks in the industry that Honda has 18 engines, and they're for, the whole season. I guess you could say really for the Indy 500, because they're not going to have 18 full-time engines. But Honda has 18 engines, and that's the number they're pretty solidly sticking to. And all of those engines, including for the Indianapolis 500, are booked on the Honda side. Now, I still think, because there are now rumors that, again, the Andretti Autosport Formula One deal has fallen through, so that means if you're Michael Andretti, you're going to have to find a spot not only for Colton Herta, but also for Kyle Kirkwood. And I wonder if Honda would help facilitate easing a bit of the driver moving around there. But the expansion that you are going to see, and the real silly part of silly season, is going to take place on the Chevy side. Because, as we know, that's where the teams, or those would be the teams that you should look for to expand. So when we're talking about Arrow McLaren SP potentially going to 3 cars, when you talk about whatever will happen with Carlin Racing, I know Marshall Pruitt just had an article saying that they might merge with Juncos Hollinger, and then that would become a 2-car operation. Of course, Juncos Hollinger will be full-time regardless with 1 car in IndyCar. But of course, there's all sorts of things that could happen at Carlin. I've heard that they could go to 2 cars under the Carlin banner. Their stuff could be sold. there's all sorts of things going on there. Team Penske is the only team that's reducing capacity. They're going to go down, as I said, I think probably 2 months ago at this point, when it was the whole take Pagenaud to the shank sort of thing. That actually isn't necessarily a bad thing for the sport. Let me explain why. Well, number one, it does potentially open up an Indy 500 entry where you could put like a Kyle Larson in if you wanted to. But also, what it does is it allows an Ilmor Chevy engine to be open and an Ilmor engineer to be able to service that engine that another team could use. We saw this at the Indy 500 last year, where there was a really last-minute entry from A.J. Foyt Racing, and the reason that was because Dreyer Reinbold deferred to enter a second car. Therefore, it opened up an Ilmor engine and engineer, and Foyt took advantage of that, hired J.R. Hildebrand, and they had a pretty decent run. I think the same logic would apply to a full-season Team Penske engine lease and engineer that have come available. IndyCar is in a really interesting place right now. In fact, all of American open wheel racing is in a really interesting place right now, because not only are you going to see the largest IndyCar grid we've seen full-time in years, but you're also going to have the largest Indy Lights grid you've seen in years. And of course, a lot of this is the European influx. Guys like Stoffel Vandoorne and Nico Hulkenberg expressing interest. Guys like Callum Ilott and Christian Lundgaard already signed up for full season entries, with actually both of those both of the latter drivers, I should say, are expanding slots on the grid. The cost that a IndyCar team owner can command for one of their seats has gone up. There's been essentially a bidding war. So, it's a two-edged sword, right? Because you have drivers coming in with big paychecks. The team owners are happy by that, of course, because they're getting paid more to put a car on the grid. The downside of that, of course, is that many of the names are not immediately recognizable or immediately established. Though I will say that IndyCar does have a good balance because, again, there are so many cars on the grid and so many drivers, thankfully, that are paid to be there, that there is some name equity, I guess you could say. But also, because of this, suddenly the price to play in IndyCar is creeping toward that $5 million mark. It wasn't too long ago that you really only needed about $1.5 million to $3 million to do a full season. That number's creeping up. And what that has done, of course, is that maybe if you don't quite have the budget right now for IndyCar, well, hey, all of a sudden the ridiculous, $1.5 million, or at least ridiculous sounding at the time, $1.5 million Indy Lights budget, which in a lot of ways would get you almost a full IndyCar season, no longer gets you a full IndyCar season. Therefore, folks who don't quite have the budget and maybe could get a scholarship and then, essentially double their budget if they're coming in with $1.5 million, then you win the championship, get another $1.5 million, suddenly you have a $3 million IndyCar budget, and potentially you can get into the sport. Lights suddenly makes sense. So the ladder system for IndyCar is beginning to make sense. Guess what? All it took was just a bunch of money being influxed into the series. Wow, amazing. It's almost like money solves all the problems. But it's going to be a fun season next year. There are going to be a lot of cars at every race. I mean, it's going to be fun to see 26, 27, 28, maybe 29 cars at a place like Gateway or Iowa. There's potential that we could see bumping at tracks outside of the Indianapolis 500, which is just unfathomable. That hasn't happened since around 1998, 1999 in the kart series. And some people will, poo-poo that, of course, because they were doing that about the Indy 500. But I think, if you're sending, this is going to sound weird, but if you're at a place where you can afford to send full season, fully funded cars home, you're in a good space. So I think that's good. I mean, this is all looking up from that perspective. What isn't quite looking up, unfortunately, is the future of NASCAR gaming, at least the immediate future, because I do want to be very fair when I talk about this. And of course, also, you have to think Motorsports Games is developing the new NASCAR game. In a couple of years, they will also develop the first IndyCar game in 16 years. So what's the issue? Well, to put it bluntly, the release of NASCAR 21 Ignition has not been the most stellar. There have been glitches, there have been missing features. For example, stage racing, which has been in NASCAR since about 5 or 6 years ago now, is not a feature currently implemented in the game. Therefore, this really isn't, I'll just say it. This is not a game that has been released ready for prime time. And I want to be very clear that I'm not, because I think some people are going to be unfair to the developers. And I don't want to be unfair to the developers, but at the same time, I want to explain the situation to the people who perhaps don't understand it. Because I think a lot of the anger that's going to surround NASCAR 21 Ignition's release is going to be misguided. So, NASCAR 21, or all the NASCAR games, in fact, NASCAR has a contract that whoever holds the license for NASCAR has to release a game every single year. What that does, unfortunately, is creates a bit of a crunch development-wise. And again, I don't want to speak too authoritatively on this because, again, I'm not a game developer and I don't work for motorsport games. But this is how I understand it. So you're on a time crunch already. This game has been in development for 2 years as it's been released in its current state. But unfortunately, with the NASCAR mandate, it has kind of exacerbated a problem that has plagued modern gaming, let's be honest, probably for the past decade. And that is, since the creation, or not creation, but since games it has become normalized to have an online connection with a video game, it has become normal that developers will release a game and then spend months and months and months adding features through patches that can all be downloaded online. And that's going to happen with NASCAR 21 Ignition. They've already confirmed that. What that does, unfortunately, means that essentially when you get a new game, especially when it's a new franchise built from the ground up like this is, the first game, and again, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but essentially what you were playing is a beta of what ultimately will be a polished, finished product about the second or third iteration. It's unfortunate to say it that way, but that's the reality of modern gaming. So, some of you may have seen the video I helped IDK Player do at Daytona. And I'm sure it didn't do me any favors with motorsports games when I said this, but that's the reason I said you shouldn't pre-order this one. Wait until people have gotten their hands on it and played it for specifically this reason, because you don't know, because you almost certainly are going to get a beta or some sort of a not totally finished, 100% polished game. You're just not going to expect that anymore. Until the third or fourth iteration when they have refined exactly what... I mean, even the F1 games were this way, so I don't want to pretend like this is only a motorsport game problem. But you have to decide if the game is in a state that you feel is acceptable, where you can look past some of the flaws and support the developers. But I don't think it's an obligation to support the developers and buy a product that is inferior either. And that's the thing with the IndyCar game. And I guess the one advantage that the IndyCar game has is that, a lot of these things that are going to happen with the NASCAR game, hopefully motorsport games will learn from them and apply that to the IndyCar game that's going to release in about, 1 and 3/4 year. I think it's coming out in May of 2023. It's going to be based on the 2022 season, of course. But that's the thing. And it's disappointing that this is how things are, because I did grow up in an era, I was at the end of the era for sure, but I grew up in an era where, games didn't need a day one patch. They didn't need enormous fixes on day one. They were more or less ready to go, and the glitches that were there, more or less, you could just kind of roll your eyes at and get over, because the game had been, thoroughly tested and delayed if necessary to get it out. And unfortunately, that just isn't what modern gaming is. So I'm not blaming motorsport games for a problem that they didn't create, and a problem that ultimately, plagues the entire game industry. But I will say again, this is that this logic will also apply to the IndyCar game, and don't mistake me on that. I'm not, just because it's an IndyCar game, just because I want it, and just because of the fact that it's going to come out, and the fact that IndyCar does need a video game, there's no doubt about it. But that does not mean I'm going to shill for said video game. And I'm going to tell you up front that, the first iteration is probably not going to be, perfectly polished. It's not, don't expect that. And unfortunately, I know we're not supposed to lower our expectations, but you have to understand that when a game is first coming out, that you have to lower your expectations. You have to know, because that's what I didn't understand about this game, is that how do you guys go through NASCAR 11, and I'm talking about the community here. You go through NASCAR 11, you go through NASCAR Heat Evolution, and you expect anything different from the first title of a new series. This is just how gaming is. No matter who the developer is, no matter what engine they're working from, no matter what physics they're working from. When was the last time a game franchise launched and the first game was perfect? I don't know, man. So yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing to keep track of. Though I will, again, say this. I mean, I hope and wish that Motorsport Games is able to fix as many issues as possible with this game, and it becomes, because, that's the thing I hear guys like Drive-Thru on Twitter say, and I do agree with them, because I've only played 3 laps of the game, and I haven't bought it yet, because it's still, you still have to buy, I think, the $90 edition to have it. But, there is there's something there. It's not completely unredeemable. Again, it's just the problem that I suspect the game that we really want is probably 2 years away. So NASCAR Ignition 3 will probably be the game you all expected NASCAR 21 to be. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content, and I will see you in the next video.